We will leave it to our political lectures to go into the policies that are emerging that make that possible. But just as an epidemiologist, regardless of politics, would explore the consequences of wearing masks for a population, we should ask if the ecologies of the so-called Eastern Bloc countries, the USSR and its satellite states in the former political Eastern Europe, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, and in Asia, the Mongolian People's Republic, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and the People's Republic of Kampuchea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the People's Republic of China before the Sino-Soviet split in 1961, and of the neighboring countries in those regions were to become carbon neutral and adopt environmentally responsible technologies, what impact might that have? Here we have to turn to the famous IPAT equation for our modeling. You may remember IPAT. It was the mathematical notion of a formula put forward to describe the impact of human activity on the environment. Impact, I, equals population P times affluence A times technology T. Now the Chinese have a famous saying that Chairman Mao correctly intoned despite the disaster of famine caused by his Great Leap Forward. It was a land collectivization policy that didn't work out. But even though he and his regime got things very wrong, primarily because they made the shift to industrial monocropping agriculture, the saying that he quoted still holds profound truth. He said, "Every mouth that is born with 2 hands to feed it." Now that's a marvelous way to conceptualize the prosumer ethic, the idea that we are not, as the modern capitalist West would describe us, merely consumers, but producers as well. Alvin Toffler, author of Future Shock, called us in his 1980 sequel, The Third Wave, prosumers, meaning creatures who both produce and consume at the same time. And though the usual idea on our side of the globe is that we humans consume goods and then inevitably transform them through our use and produce bads, the Chinese, who saw even our shit as a good, calling it night soil to close the metabolic rift, have always seen us as prosumers, producing goods and consuming goods, saying basically it's all good, or it can be in the right hands and mouths. We should also point out that every mouth born is born with 2 eyes to see better with and envision sustainability, is born with 2 ears to hear words of wisdom with, and a brain to think and create with. So where a Westerner would usually read the IPAT equation with a worried eye, looking at rising P population as a thing to be feared, the Chinese at their core, and Eastern philosophy in general, doesn't see more of us as necessarily a bad thing. Remember that as Lynn White, the anthropologist, famously pointed out in his 1967 paper, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, that crisis really is anchored in the Western, I call it Northern, interpretation of the Judeo-Christio-Islamic scriptures found in the desert regions that had emerged from and gained statist power from a disastrous attitude toward ecology that desertified the region but made empires rich, and so was sustained with every civilization's collapse as the wealthy power elites fled and then set up camp elsewhere to continue their rapacious behavior. Lynn thus blamed our ecological crisis on our distorted religious heritage. He said, quote, "Especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen, viewed historically. Modern science is an extrapolation of natural theology, and second, that modern technology is at least partly to be explained as an Occidental, voluntarist realization of the Christian dogma of man's transcendence of and rightful mastery over nature. But as we now recognize somewhat over a century ago, science and technology, hitherto quite separate activities, joined to give mankind powers which, to judge by many of the ecological effects, are out of control. If so," he said, "Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt. I personally doubt that disastrous ecologic backlash can be avoided simply by applying to our problems more science and more technology," he said. "Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes toward man's relation to nature, which are almost universally held not only by Christians and neo-Christians, but also by those who fondly regard themselves as post-Christians." He said, despite Copernicus, all the cosmos rotates around our little globe. Despite Darwin, we are not, in our hearts, part of the natural process. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. He said, the newly elected governor of California, like myself, a churchman but less troubled than I, spoke for the Christian tradition when he said, as is alleged, when you've seen one redwood tree, you've seen them all. To a Christian, a tree can be no more than a physical fact. The whole concept of the sacred grove is alien to Christianity and to the ethos of the West. He said, for nearly 2 millennia, Christian missionaries have been chopping down sacred groves, which are idolatrous because they assume spirit in nature. He said, what we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecologic crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one, end quote. Now, the East is unburdened with this legacy for the most part. Though it has blundered into it in recent decades, it might still be able to pull out of it in time. Lin wrote, quote, the beatniks, who are the basic revolutionaries of our time, show a sound instinct in their affinity for Zen Buddhism, which conceives of the man-nature relationship as very nearly the mirror image of the Christian view. Zen, however, is as deeply conditioned by Asian history as Christianity is by the experience of the West, and I'm dubious of its viability among us, end quote. So he was worried, of course. But let's imagine for a moment that the Zen Buddhist meme of man as part of nature, coupled with the prosumer ethic of producing and consuming goods in a circular economy, finally takes root in the East, because there isn't a millennia-long cultural resistance to it enculturated in their social and political systems. Could the very fact that China has close to 1.5 billion people, close to 20% of the Earth's population, and India close to 1.4 billion, with these two countries alone representing close to half of the Earth's population, be an asset rather than a liability? What about the fact that the Eastern Hemisphere, of which we are speaking, represents 82% of the Earth's human population? If the Western Hemisphere only accounts for 18% of the population, then we do have to pin our hopes on the East. But rather than worrying so much about drastic ways to bring the population parameter down, P, to keep the number of hungry mouths down, we should be thinking of all those people's hands and ears and eyes and hearts and minds as our allies. As I said at National Geographic in a lightning talk a few years ago, the world may be filled with a-holes, and more of them every day, but that could be a good thing now that we know what Marco Polo learned on his travels to the East in the 1300s when Europe was gripped with plague. Every a-hole literally produces fuel and fertilizer, and the more people we have, the more solutions we have. Here in America, where it seems we can hardly get 50% of our population to agree with the other 50% these days, and half the population is being led to believe that climate change is a hoax, it might seem far-fetched to think that we can mobilize an ever-growing population to be the source of good rather than bad. But when P is informed by a different philosophy, an ethic of cooperative transduction, then the A and T parts of the IPAT equation become relevant. Asia's getting wealthier. China in particular is becoming more wealthy. And as I learned on my trip around the country of China with Into USF program last May of 2019, the affluence is being accompanied with very effective environmental technologies, T, and ideas, I, which we don't talk about. For one thing, China's planting an enormous number of trees. It is true that for a couple of decades, China's push to develop caused an enormous amount of ecological disruption. But they had a plan. I learned about the plan by sitting down for lunch at the Clinton Global Initiative with William McDonough, author of Cradle to Cradle. William has been designing one of China's experimental cradle-to-cradle ecological cities. Now, many critics have emerged to point out the failings of the enterprise, but my visit to China in May showed that despite the shortcomings of their ambitious embrace of industrial ecology, they are doing a lot better than we are.